Brethren, I've chosen to present a paper today from Solomon, a man of Tyre, worker in brass, a look at the Hiramic legend and the metal workers. In summary, the story of Hiram Abiff. The impact made on the progress of human society by the development of metalworking cannot be overestimated. Compared with the timescale covered by the Old and New Stone Ages, the Copper, Bronze and Iron Ages followed in rapid succession. Each of these metalworking ages emanated from an area we now call the Middle East. The men who smelted and forged metals, including precious metals, were an elite band whose skills were highly prized and in great demand, particularly for the manufacture of weaponry. Copper was really too soft for making swords or arrowheads, but when the admixture of tin was discovered, it produced a much harder, stronger medium, but one still relatively easy to shape into weapons and tools. Civilization flowered and empires were raised during the Bronze Age, which lasted for almost 1,500 years, from roughly 3000 to 1250 BCE. Around this time, the ziggurats at Ur, the pyramids of Giza, and Stonehenge in Wiltshire were built, each requiring precise geometric calculations and knowledge of the principles of architecture and astronomy. Artists revelled in the production of sculptures, jewellery, and decorative artefacts using an extensive range of materials. During the reigns of David and Solomon, a well-used trade network existed on both land and sea. It facilitated the transport of metalliferous ores from the mountainous regions of Anatolia, Zagreb, and parts of the Arabian Peninsula. Ingots, smelted in situ, were exchanged for agricultural products such as wheat, wine, and olive oil, produced in the fertile and populous river valleys of Mesopotamia and Egypt. It also facilitated a growing trade in cloth and dyes, which were much in demand. The men of Tyre and the Phoenicians took full advantage of their geographical position on the eastern Mediterranean coast to import and export this wide variety of goods. They were the great entrepreneurs of the ancient world, and their galleys ranged from as far as Spain, North Africa, and beyond, perhaps as far as the British Isles, where the tin-laden cassiterite ores were mined in the Cornwall Peninsula. The priceless natural resource in the Tyre hinterland were the great forests of the Lebanese hills, of tall cedars and cypress, which became the traditional building material for temples and palaces throughout all of the Middle Eastern civilization. A certain king of Tyre, Hiram, was contemporary to both David and Solomon. Within his domain were factories producing all kinds of metals, especially bronze, and pottery, cloth and glassware. Phoenician architects were employed to design temples and palaces, built and finished by their stonemasons. It is entirely probable that King Hiram had appointed a master architect to oversee all important internal projects, and some scholars believe that the king's superintendent of works was also named Hiram. The Hebrew name Hiram, or Huram, means "my brother is exalted," which has a neat Masonic implication. A further complication exists with the name because Hiram, the chief architect, had a son by a woman from the neighbouring tribes of Naphtali, who was also called Hiram. In the early years of his reign, King Hiram was troubled by fearsome people who dominated the area between Phoenicia and Egypt. The Philistines wanted to extend their control of the entire Palestinian coastline, from Joppa to Tyre, and so Hiram enlisted the help of many mercenaries to fight the Philistines. A significant number of trained soldiers, under a young and gifted general called David, were recruited from the Hebrew tribes to the east. David enjoyed a considerable reputation for judgment and bravery in war, gained whilst fighting the Philistines under the banner of Saul, the Israelite king. Unfortunately, Saul became jealous of the successful young warrior, and David had to flee from the court of Saul with some of his troops. The Philistines were eventually defeated, and their territory absorbed into a greater Phoenicia. This territory included the important port of Joppa, thus the control of the trade routes to Egypt by land and sea. The grateful Phoenician king did not forget his debt to David, and the two became close friends. When David succeeded Saul as king, their friendship continued, as recorded in the first book of Kings, chapter 5, verse 1. Their close relationship was also recorded in the second book of Samuel, chapter 5, verse 11. When David established his capital in Jerusalem, he needed to build a city and temple worthy of his nation. He naturally turned to his close friend Hiram. The Bible records that Hiram sent messengers to David and cedar trees, also carpenters and masons, to build a house. One may assume that the house was a royal palace. David had also announced his intention to build a house for the Lord, to be fitted resting place for the Ark of the Covenant, and therefore God's very presence. In fact, he purchased the site for the temple from a local farmer called Araunah the Jebusite, but the temple was never built. It might be reasonable to suppose, however, that carpenters and masons sent by Hiram would be under the control of Hiram, his superintendent architect. Perhaps it was during his stay in Jerusalem that he met and married his wife from the tribe of Dan, and took her back to Tyre. A son was born to them, and what could be more appropriate that the child should be named after his father, and also in honour of the king. David reigned for 25 years, and we can assume that the boy Hiram would have been trained in the same skills as his father, learning geometry, astronomy, architecture, metal founding, weaving and glassmaking, all of the knowledge so freely available in the Phoenician capital. When David died, he was succeeded by his ambitious son, by the lovely Bathsheba. He was called Solomon. The plans of David were revived, and Solomon launched into the costly project with the help of King Hiram, who once again provided men, materials, and credit. The building of the royal palace and the temple adjoining on the holy Mount Moriah took 7 years to complete, and exhausted the vast amount of treasure David had amassed. There are two accounts of the project. The first is in the first book of Kings, chapters 5 and 7, written about 700 years before the second account in the second book of Chronicles, chapter 2 to 4. The two are not identical, and in the second, Hiram becomes Huram. Both agree that Solomon sent for Hiram out of Tyre, which could have been either the father or the son. Now we have an additional name, Abith, which in Hebrew means his father. In the second account, in the second book of Chronicles, it states, "And Huram finished the work that he was to make for King Solomon for the house of God, to wit, the 2 pillars, the pots also, and the shovels and the flesh hooks and all their instruments did Huram his father make to King Solomon for the house of the Lord of bright brass," as detailed in the second book of Chronicles, chapters 4, verses 11 to 16. Now, Huram, or Hiram, his father becomes Huram, or Hiram Abith. The elder Hiram must now have been very old man, and may have delegated the detailed work to his son. He may never have gone to Jerusalem, preferring to remain at home with his wife in Tyre, leaving his gifted son to finish the product without interference. But the legend of Hiram Abiff does not end there, for allegedly he was savagely murdered by 3 jealous overseers before he could complete the work. They are even named in some American lodges as Jabila, Jabilo, and Jabilim. Fact or fiction, legend or allegory, that is for you, the reader, to decide. I hope you've enjoyed this paper, brethren. It's interesting to note that, as with many things from ancient history, records have been not kept well, have perhaps been lost over the generations, and we often don't have precise answers. But this makes a very interesting story and a background to the one that we refer to as Hiram Abiff. Thank you, brethren, and I look forward to making another presentation in about a week's time.